Bribery, espionage, international power struggles, the search for gold. All part of our story of discovering the world. Hello, I'm Patrick Stewart. During the 14th century, in the competition to dominate the seas, China held the lead. 100 years later, the great empire of Portugal was first in the race to sail around Africa, only to be closely challenged by Venice and later by Spain. To find the spices and the gold that would increase their power and wealth, these nations would stop at nothing, not even murder. And now, part 2 of The Shape of the World, The Secrets of the Sea. Paris, 1568. A renegade Portuguese mapmaker, André Homem, is living in the shadow of death. Homem's sin was to defect to France with the secrets of the sea. Until just under 500 years ago, the oceans divided Earth into several unconnected worlds. Seamen of many nations and civilizations sailed long distances from home, but none had made the link between all the different lands and seas. For whoever did chart the seas, the prize would be wealth and empire. In the end, knowledge of the oceans was first gained by Portuguese sailors. Here in Macau, just off the coast of China, is evidence of their success. A Chinese island still displaying the panoply of Portuguese empire. The story which led to Portugal's achievement had many twists and turns. It began with a puzzle and ended with treachery. "700 years ago, the mysteries of China were attracting a new breed of traveler, the European. Between 1250 and 1350, under the vast and peaceful empire of the Khans, the overland route from Europe to the east was open. Merchants like Marco Polo and missionaries like the Franciscan Friar Oderic wrote tantalizing accounts of this fabulous land.
Canton itself had more ships than whole of Italy put together. And then he says that in Canton you find the biggest snakes in the whole world. And that if you go to China and you don't eat snake meat, you don't know what is to eat. It's the best meal of the world, you know, the snakes. So he ate them, you see, in Canton.
The Chinese were superior in more than cooking. China was also far ahead of Europe in the art of navigation at sea. She had made one crucial breakthrough, the invention of the compass. Its origins were strange indeed. They lay in the ancient skill of feng shui, or geomancy. Geomancy means the art of aligning the homes of the living and the graves of the dead, so that they harmonize with the local currents of the cosmic breath. Still today, in the design of the most modern buildings, like the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, geomancy remains a vital factor, and the geomancer's compass the means of deciding the correct alignment.
喺我哋中國嘅風水嚟講咧，呢個係有一個羅盤啦，羅盤就係我哋中國嗰個睇地方嘅方位用嗰個羅盤啦，好與唔好係靠嗰個羅盤去指示嘅。咁同埋咧就叫做巒頭啦，所謂巒頭者咧就講 我哋嗰個地理嘅形勢個環境，咁所以咧就要有五合要原則要符合。
Desks inside, lions outside, all have to be correctly laid out. Over 2,000 years ago, the Chinese realized that if you rubbed a needle with a lodestone, it became magnetic and pointed to north or south. This was soon put to practical use. First, there was a geomancer's table. Then came a magnetic spoon to find direction. The next idea was a floating needle. This meant that a compass could be used even on a swaying ship at sea. By the early 1400s, the Chinese were masters of the sea, led by the greatest admiral of the age. His name was Cheng Ho, and he became known as the Three-Jewel Eunuch. Cheng Ho's ships were massive and magnificent, probably measuring over 500 feet long. In his first expedition, he set out with 62 ships carrying a huge cargo of gold and treasures and a force of 62,000 men. Cheng Ho's fleets made 7 expeditions in the first 30 years of the 15th century. Their domains stretched from Java to India, Arabia, and East Africa. Yet these were not military expeditions. Their purpose was to display the superiority of Chinese culture and civilization, and to ensure that foreign countries paid due respect to the emperor. Herein lay the great puzzle. If the Chinese navy was so superior, why did it not sail on and make the link to Europe, and indeed the New World? The answer lay in China's traditional isolation. After Cheng Ho's 7th voyage, a new faction took over at court, and further expeditions were stopped.
The Chinese thought that they had everything for themselves. They did not want anything from outside because they had everything by themselves. Knowledge, all the products, the whole world was theirs. What for? To import new things from outside if they have them.
Imperial edicts threatened harsh punishment for Chinese who ventured abroad. And for Europeans, the land route to the east was closed. The revolutionary idea of sailing all the way to China was first suggested by the seamen of Genoa in Italy, one of the great city-states of medieval Europe. Genoa could have had the greatest empire of all, but the city was in constant chaos. Faction fights and rival warlords abounded. In one 40-year period, there were no less than 14 revolutions. Genoa's harbor was ringed by a steep curtain of mountains. The only domain into which she could expand was the sea. Genoa's sailors were the world's best. One observer wrote, "They dominate the sea. They build galleys with which they go forth to pillage the most distant regions, returning home with their spoil." In 1291, 2 Genoese brothers, the Vivaldos, embarked on an epic voyage, the first attempt to sail from Europe to the east. At that time, this must have been the Vivaldos' worldview, the medieval 3-continent Earth encircled by a great ocean around which they hoped to sail. The Vivaldos were helped by 2 pieces of new technology. The first was the compass, which had finally arrived in Europe at the end of the 12th century. With it came all sorts of delightful rumors. It was said, for example, to have the power to reunite husbands and wives, a useful instrument for sailors whose women might be tempted to seek comfort while they were away at sea. The second innovation was a new type of map. In medieval Europe, sheep did not just provide meat and wool for clothes. They had a surprising extra use. Their skins provided the vital, weatherproof raw material for a chart impervious to the salty sea spray. This is the oldest one to survive, made in Genoa at the end of the 13th century. Its shape is that of the sheepskin, and it's crisscrossed by a series of lines which were the courses to be followed across the sea. Its use was not greatly different from a navigational chart of today. The seaman could plot his course between 2 points and measure it out with a pair of dividers. In the days of sail, it was more difficult to keep to such straight lines, so allowances had to be made for different tacks.
Sto esaminando una carta nautica del 1300. Prima impressione è quella di con quanta accuratezza a quei tempi, con i mezzi a disposizione di quei tempi, il cartografo abbia potuto disegnare, vista da un marinaio che ha trascorso 34 anni di vita a mare e che conosce bene il Mediterraneo, mi meraviglia come possa 600 anni fa abbiano potuto redigere una carta nautica, ma dà l'esatta, direi esattissima idea di cos'era il Mediterraneo e degli stati che si affacciavano su questo mare.
However accurate and artistic these charts might have been, they were limited to the coasts of Europe and the Mediterranean Sea, the areas already known. For the Vivaldos seeking to sail all the way from Genoa round Africa to the east, the charts simply ran out. Not surprisingly, somewhere along the way, they and their ships disappeared. Exactly why and where has remained a mystery ever since. With today's high-technology satellite navigation, it's hard to imagine what it must have been like sailing into the unknown a few hundred years ago. There weren't even any instruments with which to measure your speed, though some rough and ready answers were found. One method led to two familiar expressions, the ship's log and its speed in knots. The idea was this: throw a log overboard, measure the passage of time with an hourglass, and then see how many knots on a piece of rope have been fed out in this given length of time. From this, a rough and ready guide of the ship's speed would emerge. But in medieval times, the captain's skill was a better guide than any instrument. Another great center of chart-making was the Mediterranean island of Mallorca. Mallorca was, over 600 years ago, a most important place, a nerve center of Mediterranean trade. In medieval times, it was occupied by Moors from North Africa. Then, in 1231, Mallorca was conquered by an invasion force sent from Spain by the King of Aragon. It became a Christian island, but still remained a link between East and West, between Arab and European knowledge. Ironically, in this island controlled by its Catholic king, economic well-being depended above all on the Jews.
Now, in Parma, unlike all other European countries, in this island and in mainland Spain, the Jews had no restrictions as to their activities. They were, as you know, in parts of Europe, restricted to money lending and many other things. Here, they were silversmiths, goldsmiths, they were politicians, the jewelers trade, they trade in silkwares which were brought along the Silk Route from India. via Persia and so on, came down to the Mediterranean here. The Jews at that time were described by Chronicle as the treasure house of this island. And most of all, they were map makers to all the great explorers of their time and time to follow. Among them, I would say the doyen of these map makers was Abraham Kreisky, for whom Parma erected a stone in the harbor here.
Abraham Kreisky's commanded respect. The king himself insisted that butchers in Parma should give him special meat to create the richest possible colors in his illustrations. Furthermore, he had the rare privilege of running water in his house. So when Abraham put something on his maps, the world took notice. In 1375, he drew the Catalan Atlas, a special commission for the King of France. It became world famous. It included its fair share of tall stories, like the pearl divers in the Indian Ocean who were magically protected from sharks, and the diamond seekers who threw meat into mountain clefts. The diamonds stuck to the meat, which was then brought down by birds. But the king of Mali in Africa, who possessed unbelievable wealth founded on gold, was real. The precise location of this huge source of gold was a secret closely guarded by the Kingdom of Mali. One man who tried to find it was Jaime Ferrer, who set out from Mallorca in 1346. He planned to sail upriver into the African interior, but his expedition disappeared and was commemorated on Abraham's atlas. It was all deeply frustrating for Europeans. They had to buy their gold from middlemen, mainly the camel caravans which crossed the Sahara Desert and brought it to the north coast of Africa. What Europeans wanted was direct access to the gold itself. There were some bizarre theories about where the gold came from. Some said it grew like carrots, others that it was brought up by ants in the form of nuggets. Abraham Kreisky suggested that there was a river of gold. According to his atlas, it flowed through Africa and out into the Atlantic Ocean not far from the Canary Islands. Was the Gold River reality or illusion? The answer to this historic question became the life quest of Henry the Navigator of Portugal. In fact, Henry only went to sea twice in his life, but his biographers were to make him the first superstar of world discovery. They wrote, "O thou prince, little less than divine, the seas and lands are full of your praises, for that you, by numberless voyages, have joined the east to the west." Medieval Portugal was an unpromising place. A peasant nation where half the land was stony, scrub-covered mountain. A country of less than 1 million people, recovering slowly from the terrible devastation of the Black Death. But at the beginning of the 15th century, Portugal stood on the threshold of history, about to make the discoveries that would change the world. She was driven by two great forces, a newly independent and dynamic monarchy, and the lure of the wide-open sea. Portugal faced onto the uncharted Atlantic Ocean. According to legend, Prince Henry set up his headquarters in southwest Portugal at Sagres, where a huge compass rose remains carved onto the rock. From here, he commissioned the first Portuguese voyages of exploration. This was his charter, obtained from his father, the king. His ultimate aim was African gold. The sea of sand which lay across the Gold Road was, wrote one of Henry's squires, unnavigable to Christians. Only the ships of the desert could cross it. So Henry sought a way round in ships of the other sort. In tiny caravels, Henry's sailors would confront the unknown. From Cape St. Vincent, the caravels headed south down the coast of Africa. They passed Cape Bojador, the very edge of the known world. By the mid-15th century, they had reached Senegal and the Gambia, 1,000 miles down the west coast of Africa. The gold was elusive, but a new trade was born: slaves. Prince Henry sent his ships under the banner of Christ. They would return with Africans for sale in the new slave markets of Europe. The Portuguese progress was keenly followed. Venice was not just the leading commercial city of Europe. It was also a center of geographic information. On the island of San Michele, there lived a monk called Fra Mauro. Fra Mauro was the most respected mapmaker of his day. If you wanted to know about the world, he was the man to see. In 1457, the King of Portugal, anxious to know where his voyages might ultimately lead, commissioned an up-to-the-minute world map from the famous monk.
È importante perché, a giudizio di tutti quanti i competenti di storia della cartografia e della geografia, riassume, si può dire, tutte le condizioni geografiche e storiche della prima metà del 400. E si sa, cioè si può facilmente dedurre che molti studiosi, navigatori o mercanti lo abbiano studiato per i loro fini, per i loro viaggi nel lontano Oriente, specialmente i mercanti in modo particolare.
The original was lost in Portugal, but Fra Mauro made a copy for the Doge of Venice, which survives magnificently today. South is at the top, but turn it round, and the familiar outlines of the Mediterranean and Italy come into view. A Venetian senator who came to see the map was shocked to find that the great city of Venice seemed so small. He complained bitterly.
Dove c'è la Venezia? E lui, Fra Mauro, ha risposto, la c'è qua, indicando col dito il punto, e siccome è una cosa quasi impercettibile, a confronto del grande planisfero, il senatore si è meravigliato. Così piccola l'avete fatta. Fate Venezia più grande e il mondo più piccolo. È un segno di megalomania, insomma, del sentimento che i veneziani avevano di se stessi e della loro repubblica a quell'epoca.
Venetians had every right to feel offended. Theirs was the richest and most splendid city in the world. The Portuguese, though, wanted Fra Mauro's map to show how their voyages down the west coast of Africa might link up with the rest of the world. Here the monk had encouraging news. He believed that it was possible to sail all the way around the bottom of Africa and on to India and China. At this time, Italians and Portuguese exchanged knowledge willingly and freely. But that was about to change. Cooperation would be replaced by rivalry, openness, by secrecy. The Sultan of Ternate flies into his kingdom. Nearly 500 years ago, these islands held the key to world power.
My family has been here for over 800 years. During that long period, my family always ruled this island. And during that time, we see many nations, they come and goes, and they looking only for one thing, that is the spice.
Air travel today makes things rather easier. But 500 years ago, as Europeans set out to reach the Mallorca Islands of Indonesia, the Spice Islands, new sea passages stretching right across the world had to be discovered.
According to history, the Arabs visit first here. They came through the land, go to China, and comes down here to Ternate.
Spices were the treasure which first beckoned Arab sailors and now the Portuguese. Black and white pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, and mace. But one particular spice was valued higher than any other: cloves. And cloves only grew in the islands centered on Ternate, in the northeast of Indonesia. Cloves had two vital uses. They were believed to be a cure for the Black Death, which had so ravaged medieval Europe. And also they acted as a preservative for meat, so important in the days before refrigeration, when meat had to be stored for months on end. From Ternate, the cloves began their 8,000-mile journey to the west. They were shipped across the Indian Ocean and arrived in the Middle Eastern markets like Alexandria in northern Egypt. There, middlemen from Venice bought them up and sold them throughout Europe. The spice trade, along with silk from China, had made Venice's fortune. Once these markets hummed with Venetians making their money out of the exotic products of the East. If Portugal was able to trade direct with the Spice Islands, and in the process cut out the Venetian middlemen, it could spell disaster for the merchants and their palatial lifestyles. Slowly, in fits and starts, the Portuguese pushed on. After Henry's death, they found African gold in plenty at Elmina. This new wealth and expertise filled the authorities in Lisbon with anxiety and suspicion. Nautical writings and charts became secret. Navigators were forced to keep an oath of silence. In 1479, the king directed that any crew of foreign ships found in the Portuguese zone of navigation off Africa should be thrown into the sea to drown. The parliament in Lisbon demanded that new lands should not even be recorded on maps.
É natural que os guardas dessa documentação procurassem, por todos os meios, evitar que as notícias contidas nos roteiros, nos diários de bordo, nas cartas de navegação, passassem para fora dos armazéns onde se guardavam e que passassem para elementos estrangeiros. Nós sabemos que Lisboa vivia nesse tempo um clima de grande expectativa e que atraía muitos aventureiros que vinham do estrangeiro à procura de notícias sobre o avanço das navegações portuguesas.
The Portuguese were almost there. In 1487, Bartolomeu Dias reached the southern tip of Africa. 10 years later, in 1497, amid loud fanfares and confident expectations, a flotilla set off from Belém in Lisbon. Its leader was Vasco da Gama. Da Gama tacked far out into the Atlantic. There he found the wind to push his boats right round the tip of Africa. In East Africa, Da Gama picked up an Arab pilot to show him the way across the Indian Ocean. On May the 20th, 1498, he reached India. His passage round Africa had not discovered a new world. Rather, it had provided the missing link between two old worlds. King Manuel of Portugal celebrated. With a certain lack of modesty, he gave himself a new title, Lord of Guinea and of the conquests, navigation and commerce of Ethiopia, Arabia, Persia and India. It was bad news for Venice and the cities of northern Italy. They sent spies to Lisbon in search of Portuguese secrets. Somehow, they needed to steal a copy of the latest Portuguese charts. It was a dangerous enterprise. At this time, the king had decreed that anyone caught sending charts abroad would be executed.
Il più audace di tutti gli agenti segreti inviati in Portogallo fu certamente Alberto Contino, inviato dal duca di Ferrara, Ercole d'Este, tipico grande signore italiano del Rinascimento.
The Duke was one of Italy's great men. His palace in Ferrara, an international salon for artists and scientists. The Duke was desperate for information from Lisbon, out of scientific curiosity or the threat to his enormous wealth. His secret agent, Alberto Contino, set to work. Contino's first known report concerned the voyage of the Portuguese Corte Real brothers to the northwest Atlantic and their rediscovery of Greenland. Most excellent prince and most unique lord, in the 5th month of navigating in open seas, the navigators discovered great bulks of concrete snow which were floating on top of the sea. Saved from the danger of the icebergs, they turned west and a vast land came into sight. The indigenous peoples live off fish and animals which abound in that country, namely huge deer clothed in long pelts.
Ma il colpo più importante di Contino fu la corruzione di un cartografo portoghese che gli fornì un grande planisfero aggiornatissimo, in gran parte copiato dalla carta ufficiale portoghese sulla quale venivano registrate tutte le scoperte più recenti.
This was it, the shape of the world in 1502. But Contino was rather an inefficient spy. After escaping from Lisbon with his map, he was next heard of in Genoa. There, he had run out of money and pawned the precious map to raise funds. He wrote to his Italian spy master explaining his predicament. Duke Ercole paid up, and the map was on its way. Handwritten legends described new peoples and landscapes, exotic animals and strange customs. Over the next decade, the Portuguese Empire spread ever further to the east. They approached the complex waters of the island-studded seas around Indonesia, and there they encountered an old tradition of navigation. These waters had been sailed for thousands of years and were part of a sophisticated network of trade routes. The Portuguese reported that these seas were already portrayed on native charts. The boogie boatmen of the South China Seas are among the descendants of the local sailors who first met the Portuguese.
Tunaro artinya ya boleh dinilai moyaku letu artinya aku kuro ya aku kembangkan ya artinya dasarna ya boleh artinya aku di mantara ke Portugal ke artinya ke sana laut di luar negeri laut di Singapura Filipina ya Siam ya Thailand apa dan lain-lain ya. Jadi Portugal mati di di Indonesia artinya suku gigi artinya mantara ke laut di Maluku ya untuk sapa rempah-rempah ya cengkeh dengan pala.
The Portuguese exploited local knowledge. In December 1511, a small fleet of 3 Portuguese ships borrowed a Javanese pilot and, using his chart, set sail for the Spice Islands. His drawings and charts show how these far-off lands began to take shape. Their ultimate target was the volcano island of Ternate. The Portuguese ships had been wrecked, and the final landing was made by local canoe.
After they make a contact, after we meet them, then we know that they came here just to find clothes.
The Portuguese had finally made it to the source of the cloves. They controlled all of the east and were in a position to corner the spice trade. In Lisbon, the king began work on a grand new monastery to celebrate the extension of his empire. One of his officials wrote that Portugal had her hand on the throat of Venice. Only one obstacle stood in Portugal's way: the imperial ambitions of her Catholic neighbor, Spain. While Portugal had been spreading her flag over India and the East, Spain had been creating her empire in the emerging New World to the West. The Alcazar, the royal palace in Seville in the south of Spain, was the navel of Spanish power. The admiral's room in the Alcazar commemorated the voyages of Christopher Columbus and other explorers under the Spanish crown. It became the strategic headquarters of Spanish trade with the New World and the repository of secret information.
Y aquí también se recopila toda aquella información que puede ser de utilidad para futuros viajes y expediciones. Informaciones geográficas e informaciones de viajes aportadas por personas individuales y también por expediciones. Aquí también la casa de contratación se convierte en algo así como un inmenso archivo documental que se procura proteger al máximo.
Nearly 500 years ago, these officers, today used to make maps for the local government in Seville, received the latest news of world discovery. Here were stored Spain's own secrets of the sea.
Debió ser muy excitante participar en la realización de los mapas, por estar dibujando todos los detalles y secretos de la ruta y lugares descubiertos por Colón y los grandes navegantes que le seguían. Muy pronto, el gobierno se dio cuenta de la importancia estratégica de estos conocimientos cartográficos y de que su información se mantuviese en secreto.
Los sistemas para conservar y mantener el secreto eran muy varios. Por ejemplo, para las copias de aquellos documentos que eran especialmente importantes, se valían de niños muy jóvenes que sabían leer y escribir, pero no tenían una idea general de la vida y por lo tanto no estaban en conocimiento de lo que realmente estaban haciendo. Se sucedían, de manera que uno empezaba, hacía varias líneas y el siguiente continuaba lo demás, para que no tuvieran una visión general del contexto.
Over in Lisbon, the Portuguese were unable to keep their secrets. For over 100 years, God had granted his favors to the small European country. She had created an empire stretching from Brazil to Indonesia. But now, step by step, it began to fall apart. Lisbon was a gossipy place, full of foreign merchants and sailors. The flow of vital information was unstoppable. And now worse was to follow: desertion. In 1517, Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese sea captain, arrived in the Spanish headquarters, Seville. Magellan had argued with the King of Portugal over money. Now he brought to the Spanish his plan to sail west round South America to the Spice Islands and give Spain access to the precious cloves. It would be the most terrifying voyage of all. First, the passage round South America. But the calm of the Pacific would be even worse. Nobody guessed how vast it might be. Finally, they reached the Spice Islands. Magellan himself did not survive to see them. He had been murdered during his crew's brief stay in the Philippines. But he had shown that it was possible to sail round the world.
The Spanish arrived when the Portuguese were already settled here. They arrived about 1520. But they could not settle in Ternate, and they settled the island in front of Ternate that is called Tidore.
Spain too had reached the source of the cloves, and now she claimed that she, not Portugal, had the right to the Spice Islands. In 1494, Spain and Portugal had, with the Pope's approval, divided the world between them along this line. The western half was Spain's, the eastern half Portugal's. But where was the dividing line on the other side of the world? And on whose side were the Spice Islands? Only mapmakers could make the calculation, and in map-making, the Portuguese were the masters. Spain came up with a simple ruse.
Dibujantes de mapas portugueses venían a trabajar para nosotros en España, en parte debido a que nosotros les pagaban mucho mejor que el rey de Portugal, y naturalmente esto significaba que España podía conseguir todos los conocimientos portugueses.
And of course, if you were a Portuguese mapmaker working for the Spanish, you simply put the Mallorca Islands with all their spices in Spain's half of the world. The defection of mapmakers went on. The Lisbon quarter where they lived was notoriously violent. Diogo Homem, a renowned chartmaker, was arrested on a murder charge. While out on bail, he fled the country and headed for the safety of Northern Europe.
Diogo Homem fugiu então para a Inglaterra e, naturalmente por instâncias do pai, pediu ao rei Dom João III perdão pelo seu crime. O rei, que estava muito interessado em que os seus cartógrafos regressassem a Portugal, deu-lhe imediatamente o perdão na condição de ele regressar ao reino no prazo de 8 meses. Contudo, Diogo Homem nunca mais regressou ao reino. Viveu em Inglaterra e depois em Veneza, onde desenhou quase toda a sua grande produção de várias dezenas de mapas contidos em atlas e cartas avulsas.
This World Atlas, made for Queen Mary of England in 1558, was one of Diogo Homem's masterpieces. By now, the west coast of Africa was precisely charted. The attractions of the Far East were open to any European. Homem painted delightful vignettes of life in the still mysterious New World to the west. But the strange story of Portugal's mapmakers had one more extraordinary twist. At its center was Diogo Homem's relative, André Homem. Today, only one of his maps survives, but in his time, André Homem was called the Prince of Cosmographers. He too had escaped from Lisbon. His crime is not known. He went to Paris to work for the King of France, who was making plans to grab a share of the new riches opened up by the Portuguese. Then André Homem went to London. There he fell in with a Portuguese traitor, Antão Luís, who was later hanged. Homem and Luís wrote to Queen Elizabeth of England, offering their navigational expertise for a most irregular venture. They proposed to take a fleet on her behalf to West Africa and raid the Portuguese gold stores. The offer was turned down. Homem returned to Paris, where the long arm of Portuguese justice was waiting. Homem was lucky. The shots missed and only tore his clothing. While Portuguese defectors like Homem continued to scheme abroad, the Portuguese poet Camões was writing the Lusíads, a celebration of his nation's achievements. This is the story of heroes who, leaving their native Portugal behind them, opened a way to Ceylon and further, across seas no man had ever sailed before. Nymph of the Tagus, give me a song equal to the deeds of your so warlike people. Great king, whose far-flung dominions greet the sun's gaze alike when it rises, when halfway through its course, and when it sinks to rest. Give ear while I sing the greatness of the race that acknowledges your sway. But the young king to whom Camões addressed his poem would lead Portugal to military defeat by the Moors in North Africa. His country would be taken over and ruled by Spain. The Portuguese were being pushed aside. New nations were about to enter center stage, and new empires created.
It is because of clothes that all nations, among others, Portuguese, Spaniards, Dutch, and the British, sail all over the world to find Ternate. And at first, they came here just to want to make trade. Afterward, because of maybe clothes gives them good profits, they want to control the trade. And they succeed in control the trade. And then after that, they goes further, controlling all the political aspects of our state. And so then, according to me, it starts with what they call imperialisms. So imperialisms, in fact, start from Ternate.
By the end of the 16th century, the Portuguese possessions in Africa and the East were under threat from the ambitious sailors of Holland. These people's lands would be taken over by new masters. The countries of Northern Europe, England and France, were seeking a way to the Spice Islands by a northwest passage around the top of a new world called America. The Portuguese had unlocked the secrets of the sea. Now they were open to their European rivals. The rivalry for dominance of the seas did not end with the discovery of all the oceans and all the continents. In our time, as in the past, European and American nations have repeatedly gone to war over their right of free passage across open seas. As the 19th century drew to a close, The United States utilized the hard-won knowledge of Portuguese and Spanish navigators. Existing maps revealed the possibility of shortening trade routes by building a canal across Central America. The Spanish military presence in Cuba appeared to threaten such ambitions. The American battleship Maine was sent into Havana Harbor to protect American interests. It was blown up on the 15th of February, 1898, and 260 men were killed. Although it was never proven, blame for the explosion fell on Spain. War fever mounted, and Congress voted to blockade Spanish ports. 8 Spanish ships in Manila Harbor in the Philippines were destroyed on May 1st by a U.S. squadron under Admiral George Dewey. Later that month, Spanish ships entered the harbor of Santiago de Cuba. After heavy fighting, their fleet was destroyed. By July, the Spanish-America War was over, with America the victor. Like 15th century Portugal, the United States achieved international prominence through its naval power. To demonstrate that power, in 1907, President Theodore Roosevelt sent a fleet of battleships on a goodwill tour. The ships were painted white to signify their peaceful mission, all part of TR's big stick diplomacy. In the years before the First World War, the United States competed with Great Britain and Germany for peaceful supremacy of the seas. Huge ocean liners and freighters vied to carry passengers and goods across the Atlantic, and millions of immigrants crossed the ocean from Europe to America without interference. All that was soon to change. When the Great War started, the British Navy controlled the seas with its mighty big-gun battleships, the dreadnoughts. But German submarine attacks posed a deadly challenge as they began striking ships without warning. On May 7th, 1915, the British passenger ship Lusitania was torpedoed off the coast of Ireland. 1,924 lives were lost, including 128 Americans. Though the ship did carry munitions for the Allies, it was not armed. The incident outraged America and encouraged its entry into the war. Another attack without warning in another ocean brought America into the Second World War. The nearly total destruction of its Pacific Fleet on December the 7th, 1941, when the Japanese bombarded Pearl Harbor. As the war progressed, the struggle for free passage of the North Atlantic continued. Britain and Germany set up blockades to prevent shipments of food and weapons. German U-boats menaced Allied shipping. But 75,000 crossings were made, and at peak periods, no less than 700 Allied ships were afloat at the same time. Espionage was as much a part of modern warfare as in the days when Portuguese sailors sold secrets of their expeditions. Throughout World War II, the United States feared incursions on both coasts. In fact, German spies, armed with maps and explosives and intent on destroying war factories, did land by submarine in Florida and Long Island. In the Middle East, another struggle for free passage of the seas took place. Although an international convention in 1888 declared the Suez Canal open to all nations in peace and in war, Great Britain prevented her enemies from using it during both world wars. In 1950, Egypt banned Israeli ships from the canal. In 1956, after Britain withdrew financial aid, Egyptian President Nasser seized control of the canal's revenues. Israel, Great Britain, and France attacked. United Nations peacekeeping forces were sent in, and the Suez Canal was reopened in 1957. 10 years later, it was blocked again, this time by sunken ships during another Arab-Israeli conflict. It finally reopened in June 1975. Much closer to home, the United States continues to be concerned with the Panama Canal as a vital commercial and military waterway. Back in the Spanish-American War, the battleship Oregon had to travel 13,000 miles around South America to reach Cuba. Had the canal been in place, the trip would have been 1/3 as long. During World War II, some 14,000 ships passed through its locks. The Korean and Vietnam War efforts relied on it heavily, and today it is used extensively for international commerce. It remains both a symbol and a fact of free access to the seas. Next week, we'll follow the European explorers as they cross the uncharted oceans. They sought a water route to India. What they found, of course, were unexpected, unimaginable riches of the American continents. I'm Patrick Stewart for The Shape of the World.